Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So one of the biggest, most profound joiners this year's Sedona Wolf Week is the Mountain Lion Foundation. Fred Hull and his group do incredible work spreading a positive message about the mountain lions and how these predators are incredibly important to our environment, just like the wolves. And so they're going to be coming up after lunch. Now, if we were doing a live event where you could be here for Sedona Wolf Week, Fred had this incredible presentation all set up and put together. We've been waiting for it for over a year. Unfortunately, because of what we're going through right now, he could not be here today, and we couldn't do a live event. He was going to set up a predator-proof pen right here on site in Sedona to show you how effortless it is to protect your animals from predators. In lieu of that, he's put together an incredible little piece. He's going to be available afterwards, after lunch today. But until then, you can still enter to win a predator-proof pen. It's a $700 gift to you, and all you have to do to enter, and we've had some entries, but we'd love to have more, because if you have chickens or rabbits or a farm or hobby animals, it's important that you keep them protected and you can coexist with these predators, right? It's a $700 value that we're giving away, so please enter at info@sedonawolfweek.org. Send an email in the subject, entry for predator-proof pen. We'll know what that means. We will draw the winner after lunch today before after Fred's presentation, and we go to his live Q&A. Up next, right now, coming to you are Stephanie and Jennifer, and they're going to be talking about the Wolf Lover's Guide to Saving the Planet, these easy steps that you can all take. I've learned a lot from this. They will be live afterwards with a Q&A as usual. Stay tuned.
Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Feldstein, Director of the Population and Sustainability Program at the Center for Biological Diversity, and I'm here today with Dr. Jennifer Molidor, who's a Senior Food Campaigner at the Center. And we're so glad you're joining us today for a panel on everyday actions to protect wild wolves. The Center is a national nonprofit conservation organization that uses science, policy, law, organizing, and outreach to save wildlife. And of course, not just the endangered species themselves, but also the places that they need to live. We believe in a world where both other species and humans can thrive. And the Population and Sustainability Program specifically works on that intersection of the human impact on wildlife and wild places. And we look at some of the issues that are caused by things like population pressure, unsustainable consumption, and destructive production practices. We focus on food systems in particular, specifically livestock production, industrial livestock production, because that's the industry that has the greatest impact on the planet and biodiversity. And although these are huge problems, we advocate for common sense solutions to them. Things like reproductive rights, education, equity, sustainable dietary choices, conscious consumption, and holding industry accountable for environmental violations, which also often go hand in hand with workers' rights and other human rights violations. The title for this session, The Wolf Lover's Guide to Changing the World, was adapted from my book, The Animal Lover's Guide to Changing the World. In my book, I cover the wide range of how our lives and animal lives intersect, and the ways that each of us as individuals can take action, from lifestyle choices up to political action, to help make the world a better place for animals and ourselves. And today, of course, we're focusing on wildlife, specifically wolves. Wolves, as you all know, are an iconic part of America. They're part of our culture, they're part of our stories, part of our imagination. Unfortunately, they're no longer as much in our landscape as they should be. And while this is a panel and a conference for wolf lovers, there's a lot of hatred out there for wolves, and that's resulted in their disappearance from much of the country. And we're going to talk about how those feelings toward wolves show up in policy, actions, and our lives, and ways that each of us can take action to help wolves. And I know a lot of times when we're dealing with these huge issues, a lot of people think, how much of a difference can I really make? And there are 4 key ways that individual actions matter. The first is that It aligns your daily choices with your values. It allows you to lead an ethical lifestyle. You know, like the saying goes, you get to be the change you want to see in the world. And that leads to the second way that your individual action can help create change. And that's by influencing those around you. A lot of the choices that we make and our perceptions of things are influenced by our friends and families, coworkers and peers, the people closest to us. We often trust information that we get from them more than we do from other sources. So when you lead by example, you're creating a model for others around you, and that helps to start build community and create demand. And as that demand increases, that leads us to the third way that individual action helps create change. And that's by shifting the market. As demand increases, products and services that are better for animals, they become more available. The cost starts to go down. We start to get more choices out there in the market. A lot of the market is based on what people are actually buying and asking for. And then there's the fourth way that individual actions matter, and that is collective action. And whether we're talking about political actions like voting or literally getting into the street for a protest, like those are all forms of collective action that's created by individuals. But also there's this issue of political will, which is that policymakers, they like to see which way the winds are shifting. And so when they start to see a cultural shift, when they start to see increasing demand in the markets, that starts to influence the types of policies that they will pass and the types of things that they will support or oppose. And when your individual actions are for wolves and other wildlife, that helps create more political will for policies that will protect those animals. And we need both individual and policy action. It's a lot of times there are issues that can only be addressed by a policy change or by a legal change, but we need that individual foundation, that those individuals that are creating that culture and that support for those issues. And of course, when there is a policy change that happens, that's something that needs to be implemented and embraced by individuals. And they really work hand in hand to create the widespread change that we need for wolves and other wildlife. Now, Jennifer is going to talk about some of the threats that wolves and other wildlife face and what kind of policy changes need to happen. And then we'll cover several actions that everyone can take in their day-to-day lives.
Thanks, Stephanie.
So we all love wolves and we want to be the best advocates we can be for them. So we're going to talk about a number of ways that wolves are harmed by humans and what we can do and how we can take actions to help wolves. But we need to start with one of the most destructive industries for wolves and also biodiversity as a whole. Objectively speaking, science shows us that beef production can be one of the most environmentally harmful industries. It's also the source of one of the biggest conflicts for wolves. So let's start with our shared reality and our common ground. Wild places and spaces and wildlife like wolves are important to all of us, and our values as conservationists do overlap, whether we're urban or suburban, rural or living in the wild. And I'm sure, like me, you want to live in harmony with wildlife, not conflict. I've lived in urban, suburban, rural, and even wilderness areas, national parks, and forests, and I've seen the way that this industry in particular, when it's not in harmony with natural places, can impact the land, especially in the West. So let's talk a little bit about livestock grazing and how it impacts our planet. So in a broad scope, global warming and biodiversity loss present the gravest threat to life on Earth. Animal agriculture as a whole globally represents at least 16.5% of human-induced global greenhouse gas emissions. In the US specifically, 175 endangered species are imperiled on public lands by livestock grazing. Livestock grazing also impacts 50% of endangered wildlife. More than half of the grain grown in our country goes to livestock production, and half of the water that is used goes towards livestock production. So some of the impacts of grazing include, and there are many more than this, and some of you will be familiar with this, greenhouse gas emissions. Even when we sequester carbon in the best case scenario, we're still having methane emissions. Soil degradation. Trampling causes soil moisture to decline and erosion, and this degrades soil health. Water pollution. Riparian ecosystems where land and the streams meet are vulnerable to grazing damage because of soil compaction and reduction of riparian vegetation, and that regulates water temperature and provides habitat for fish and wildlife. Manure flows into streams, causing imminent wildlife danger, decline in food necessities, and water pollution. And cattle, unlike bison, specifically stay closer to water areas. And so the best grazing practices are going to have to take that into account. So water pollution, but also water usage in supplemental feed crops, for example. Other impacts include habitat and wildlife loss. Biodiversity loss goes hand in hand with land use degradation. Grazing often requires additional agricultural infrastructure, including irrigation, clearing out forests, which kills species and reduces the potential for carbon sinks. 33% of threatened or endangered wildlife are imperiled from livestock grazing, and that includes wolves. So let's just talk about the beef industry as a whole and what we can do about it, and just put the American scope on it, because it's not that we're coming at this from a point of view of the entire industry has to go, because some people are going to make choices to reduce meat, some will eliminate meat, some will have any variety of choices that they make for their own diet. But looking at the scope of things, Americans eat 2 to 3 times the global average in beef. That's too much. It's too much for our health, it's too much for the planet, and it's too much for wolves. And I'm saying that with rancher friends. I have rancher friends, they're good people, but at the same time, the science is undeniable that this industry as a whole is not good for wolves or the planet. So we need to shift our thinking from thinking that wolves are causing conflicts to thinking that cattle are causing conflicts. This is really important to talk about this shift in terms of how we think about the steps that we take as advocates. Yes, one of the ways that we impact wolves as humans is through our diet. Our consumption drives production, and production is harming wolves. And as Stephanie said, our individual actions can impact policy and the marketplace, and therefore protect wolves. So changing what you eat what we eat is a powerful action that we can take. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. But just for right now, cutting half of the meat and dairy from your diet can save 500,000 gallons of water, 6,000 square feet of land, and the greenhouse gas equivalent of 4,000 miles less per year driving. So just to frame what I'm going to say is that we need to put less pressure on our system, right? So even in the best scenarios where the ranchers are doing the right things and they want to do the right things, we have smaller stocking rates so that these better practices are possible. At the same time, we need to keep in mind that no method of production is going to be sustainable at the current rates of overconsumption. We're eating too much beef, we're producing too much beef. But let's talk about some of the better practices that are out there. From the center's point of view, there's 5 practices that need to be when we're talking about what better beef production is going to look like. And the first is about wildlife and the place and the value of wildlife. Native wild animals and plants must thrive. On public lands, all native species must be present, and endangered wildlife are on a trajectory toward recovery. On public and private lands, operators must use only non-lethal management for predators and so-called pests, such as gophers and prairie dogs. So keep that in mind in terms of what we're going to talk about in a second here with public lands and agencies. Second, environmental health. I think we can all agree on this. Water must be clear, clean, pure, drinkable, and this is often going to mean keeping cows away from water bodies and riparian areas and limiting the water withdrawals. 3, subsidies. No government subsidies for grazing. Taxpayers should not have to pay to make these commercial leases, subsidies, or other government's gifts to the industry profitable. 3, organic. Livestock owners should produce and promote beef that is free of pesticides, avoid some of the worst impacts of pesticide-intensive agriculture for cattle feed, and beef producers should feed cattle organic and certified chemical-free feed from start to finish. And then the last one is really more about factory farming. Cattle should not be given antibiotics as a prophylactic to prevent disease that's expected in unsanitary conditions to promote growth, etc. Instead, focus on creating sanitary conditions. So antibiotics can be used, but only to address medical issues and not to do it in advance. So Using these best practices, and which we're going to hear about talked all week at this conference, non-lethal coexistence with wildlife like wolves, organic and regenerative methods, agroforestry, agroecology, responsible care for native lands. There's a lot of promise in these methods, for sure. One of the problems is, though, is that they're not scalable, as I said, because we're eating too much, we're producing too much. So one of the things that we get from the questions that we get from people is, well, okay, so this system is not working. What if we just transfer to a system like grass-fed beef or predator-friendly beef? Again, using the benefit of the doubt and the best practices, the regenerative methods, responsible care for the environment. Here's some problems with just doing that rather than eating less beef and reducing consumption. One of them is that right now it's not really regulated. It's industry driven, and there's no clear definition of what grass-fed is. And if you asked a group of 20 people what grass-fed is, you're going to get 20 different definitions, and you think it would be just eating grass, but it's not. And so that lack of clarity in what it is and what the standards are and the regulation is rife for greenwashing and not necessarily stringent with using these better methods for environmental protection. Scalability. There's a study recently that Americans are producing and consuming so much beef that even if we swapped out to a grass-fed system, we could only produce 27% of what we're producing now. So we can't just swap over. We're going to have to bring it down. Another problem with the grass-fed is that, again, I alluded to, is that even when you try to sequester a carbon, which is not necessarily part of grass-fed, you're going to have increased greenhouse gases from increased methane. Maybe you've heard about the cow burps and that kind of thing. And then another problem with this situation of switching just to better beef rather than talking about consumption and reducing production, and this is often left out of the conversation systematically in everything you're going to read about the benefits of grass-fed beef, is that this still impacts biodiversity. It still impacts animals like wolves. It still impacts species, and it does so in a variety of ways that I'd like to talk to you about. So one of the problems with impacts on biodiversity comes through direct killing and predator control. And we're going to hear a lot about that from a lot of great people, Camilla Fox and others, for example. We're going to talk to you about wildlife services, killing contests, things like this. So let's just talk about wildlife services for a second. Wildlife services is a federal program that shoots, traps, poisons millions of animals, wolves, foxes, bears, for the livestock industry with little to no oversight, accountability, or requirement to disclose its activities. Many of the methods have involved cruel, toxic, or banned devices such as cyanide bombs, have further endangered vulnerable wildlife, and have harmed everything from kids to pets, bald eagles, and wolves. So the Center has been a legal advocate and watchdog in fighting wildlife services. We've filed a number of lawsuits. We did one last year in the federal court to stop wildlife services from shooting, trapping, and poisoning Wyoming's wild animals, for example. And one of the problems with this is that they generally, in implementation, fail to conduct the legally required environmental impact statement. So violations of NEPA, for example, are common. And we've done this in other states, and we've done this at the county level. I myself have testified at our local county level. And so that's one of the things that you can do as well, as get involved at the county level. If you find out if you have wildlife services in your county or nearby county, demand that they end their contract with the program, demand that they conduct the legally required environmental reviews, demand that they not use taxpayer funds to harm wildlife like wolves at the behest of private livestock operators. And some counties have committed to non-lethal predator management. And if that's the case, then you can use that as a model, or you can celebrate that, and you can ask them to continue doing that as well. So that brings us to state agencies, right? Moving from the county to the state. So in some areas, livestock operators are compensated for the loss of cattle, historically, if they claim it was a depredation from wolves. And that's been kind of part of the wolf reintroduction program. You only have to read Carter Niemeyer's book to understand how that has often led to false reporting. And this doesn't work for federally endangered, federally protected wolves. You're not allowed to kill them. And you're not allowed to link that to the livestock law. So you don't get the kill right for that. So in 2016, you may recall, Michigan dairy ranchers were in an uproar about wolves, an uproar about cows, even though they were the statistic for depredations is actually mind-bogglingly low compared to the reputation wolves have for attacking cattle. Many more cattle, I believe, die from natural causes. But in this instance, the Michigan Department of Natural Resources was caught lying to the feds about local wolves in order to have the wolves killed. The DNR claimed that wolves were a danger to human safety and got federal approval to kill the wolves. The wolves, they said, were prowling near daycares, coming up to people's sliding glass door. We had to get rid of the wolves. They're a danger to humans. And this kind of reflects the negative myths we carry about wolves, but also other predators, coyotes and mountain lions and so on. And like most myths, they're generally not true. And it turns out in this situation, none of these things were happening. So the state got tired really of paying out the compensation of farmers losing cattle to wolves. The reporter who exposed the story showed by uncovering these emails that the state had been lying about this. So in the Midwest, dairy industry is kind of got this huge pull, much of the way that the beef industry does in the West. So one option, if you support wolves, you might consider not trying to support the dairy industry quite as much. But you can also advocate for non-lethal control measures. But you can also do things like talk about the real numbers of depredations. You can talk with the local ranchers, you can talk with your local community and help change their mindset and shift their mindset about wolves and attacking humans, for example, and correct this. But on top of this, we need better actions for wolves. We need better policies. I think recently it's come out with Mexican wolves, what we'll talk about recently, that payouts for depredations don't necessarily change attitudes. So we need to think about what policies would work better in these types of situations. So non-lethal management and coexistence with wildlife like wolves is also important. So I want to talk about agencies and why we need better policies and working with agencies as well as range riders. So that's why non-lethal coexistence with wolves is so important. The jobs of agencies, wolf biologists, scientists studying wolves are walking that line between advocates of ranchers and environmentalists and ranchers and wolf biologists and the state agency representatives. This all gets easier as it does for wolves when we work together and we put less pressure on the system. But it's not the case everywhere. And we only have to look to Washington for some of the failures of agency oversight on both private and public lands cattle grazing. Since 2012, I know you'll be familiar with this for many of you, Washington has killed 31 wolves, 26 just for the infamous Diamond M Ranch and its owner, Bill McGirvin, which refuses to do any meaningful non-lethal conflict deterrence and wants a wolf killed for every livestock loss. The state has been doing his bidding. An entire wolf family, the wedge pack, has been destroyed, among many others. In places like Washington, most of the wolves killed for livestock conflicts are killed on public lands. The public's wolves, if you want to think about it that way, which I do, killed on public land because of this mythology of, the romantic mythology of the cowboy. But the truth is that in terms of beef production, public lands grazing is only 2% of US beef. And so it's something that we can do without, right? So public lands grazing is really an area is ripe for activism, if that's an area you want to get into in terms of improving policies. Reducing our beef consumption is also going to put less pressure on this system. But Washington also specifically needs to institute rules and clarity on what constitutes effective non-lethal management. One of those areas is range riding, for example. So some of the examples of non-lethal coexistence, which you're going to hear about all week and which you probably are familiar with, including, I think, one of the talks on predator-proof pens, paddock securing. Other ways are carcass removal, clearing up bone piles, fencing, flattery, lights, sounds, dogs, and so on. And one of the more promising programs is range riding. So the theory of range riding is great. This has been a traditional part of ranching for a long time, but it's also been lost in a lot of cases. livestock turned out kind of with little oversight. So bringing this back is really good. And we have some exceptional range riders who'll be speaking after us, I believe. And here's the thing. Without effective policy and state standards and regulation, though, you're going to run into problems. So the range riders you're going to encounter in the Sedona Wolf Week are ideal. They're top notch. They know what they're doing. They know wolves. They know cows. They know their jobs. They're good people. They're ideal. But without, proper regulation in places like Washington, there's not the impetus to get the job done right and do it as well as they're doing. It's a hard job, and not everybody has what it takes to do it. And you just have to look to Washington if you may be familiar with the situation. Without these standards, one group of range riders is currently being investigated for fraud, for misreporting their activities, and so on, might even face potential criminal charges. So it's really important that we hold non-lethal management to high standards and that we're clear and across the board. So the last example that I really want to talk about in terms of how humans are causing problems for wolves is loss of biodiversity. Let's talk about the Mexican wolf program. What is sustainable? How do wolf recovery programs need the support of wildlife advocates like you? And what can we do and how can we move forward? So the Mexican gray wolf is one of the most endangered gray wolves, and the recovery is very fragile. They were essentially wiped out in the early 20th century when what is essentially the Fish and Wildlife Service back then trapped and killed wolves for the livestock industry. After the 1973 Endangered Species Act, 5 wolves were captured alive in Mexico. 3 were bred. Those pups were later bred with 4 other wolf pups captured in the 1950s and 1960s. From those 7 founders, wolf pups were reintroduced in New Mexico and Arizona in 1998. So there's about 163 wild wolves in the Southwest, 30 in Mexico, and yet federal employees have shot and killed 20 wolves since reintroduction, and 22 other wolves have died as a result of capture operations. And now in this situation, it's really clear the lobbying of ranchers has resulted in unparalleled obstacles for the recovery program. The agency has not for years released families of Mexican wolves into the wild because the lobbying power and the states have put up such high roadblocks to reintroduction. This means, as you can imagine, the genetics of the population is highly inbred. So the agency has been taking captive bred pups, replacing natural born pups of packs into the wild with the captive born pups in attempts to create this genetic diversity, cross-fostering, but it's not working. It's not very successful at all. Very few of these pups survive. So pups born into the wild or born in captivity and then released with their parents have higher survival rates. But this isn't happening. The success of the program can't happen because the livestock industry is overriding science in terms of agency policy. So we need to have these non-lethal measures. We need to have these coexistence. We need to have policy that incorporates them in high standards, but to coexist with wildlife, we're going to need advocates to speak up for wolves and to shift the power dynamic between the overwhelming kind of influence of the livestock industry, whose interests compete with wolves, and to shift the way that we think about it so that it is more equitable and is more in the interest of wolves. So just to review, coexisting includes policy work, includes individual advocacy and actions and so on. It's also going to include how much beef we eat, the overconsumption demand, the pressure we're putting on the system, the opportunities to improve, to do better, to rethink how we're thinking about wolves, what creates conflict and doesn't, and how we coexist, but also the role of conscious consumerism and the need for better policies. And I think that's what Stephanie's going to talk about here in a minute.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. So, as Jennifer went over, there are so many different policy actions that need to happen. And each of those are an opportunity for us as individuals to weigh in, whether that's at the local or county level, whether that's at the federal level for endangered species protections and advocating for these recovery programs, or, whether it's at the state level. So there's so many ways for us to get involved politically on that side of things. But now we're going to talk about some ways that we can change our everyday actions in order to benefit wolves. So First, we're going to talk a little bit about language. Although few people have the chance to see wolves in the wild, they show up all the time in our language and culture. Think about things like the big bad wolf and wolves at the door, which Jennifer talked about. Literally, wolves at the door is used to scare people into thinking that wolves need to be killed. It presents wolves as being menacing. You think about phrases like the lone wolf or wolf in sheep's clothing, and that engenders a feeling of mistrust toward these animals. And when we see these negative language in these stories about wolves as the villains, it predisposes us to fear them, and that leads to persecution instead of protection. And this isn't just an issue in fiction, but also in how the media portrays wolves. When the media picks up those stories about the wolves at the door, when media portrays these conflicts between wolves and cattle or other places where our lives intersect with wolves, and they paint wolves as being dangerous in situations where they are not, then that helps to feed into this idea. So when you see the media villainizing wolves, that's a good opportunity to use your voice. Write a letter to the editor. If it's an outlet that doesn't have a letter to the editor, send them a message anyways. Let them know. A lot of times you can post in the comments as well on a story, and you can give an alternate version. You can give the actual reality about wolves and the role that wolves are playing in a particular story. So use your voice to correct the media, to hold them accountable for portraying wolves in a positive and responsible way. But also, as individuals, we should pay attention to the language that we use. These common sayings, things like the big bad wolf and wolves at the door, and just the other day I was saying something about the boy who cried wolf. Like, we see these all the time because they're part of our culture for many of us. And so pay attention to when you're using those sayings, and seek other opportunities, other ways to say what you need to say that don't keep perpetuating these negative ideas around wolves. And it's also important, as we think about how these showed up in our culture, to think about the next generation as well, and share stories and books that portray wolves as the hero instead of the villain. I know that at this conference that there's a great session on wolf stories where Susan Strauss is discussing positive wolf myths and fairy tales, and some that predate Little Red Riding Hood. And there are some books out there already that you can share with little kids. There's a picture book about OR7 called Journey. OR7 also inspired a chapter book called The Wolf Called Wander. For older readers and adults, you may want to check out The Wolf Chronicles. The first book is Promise of the Wolves by Dorothy Hurst. And it tells the story of how wolves and humans really came together. And it leads to our shared lives, ultimately to our shared lives with dogs that we love so much. And so a lot of this is changing the way that we tell stories about wolves. And it may seem like a little thing, but each of those stories, every time we can replace negative language or a negative story with a positive, it helps to subtly shift the way that we as individuals and as a culture think about wolves. So the second action that I'm going to talk about is getting to know your wild neighbors. So if you live near wolves, it's important to learn about them and correct any misconceptions that you may have about coexisting with them. I mean, after all, we're in their habitat, and it's important for us to understand what they need, as well as where there may be potential conflicts. Discover how wolves shape the environment around you and how to manage any potential impacts. And we need to understand that they're not the enemies, that they're our neighbors. You may not have wolves where you live, but you likely have coyotes, considering coyotes are really every major city in the US, and they're very common across the country. But there are also a lot of conflicts with coyotes as well. They're very much villainized. But whether we're talking about coyotes or bears or wolves or even smaller animals like raccoons or rodents, get to know what wildlife live in your area. The more you know and understand how they live, what they need, the easier it is to see that we don't need to fear them, that we can coexist with them. And learning about the threats that they face in your area can help you protect them. And when you have that knowledge, when you learn that, share it with your neighbors. Educate your friends and those around you. Talk to community groups about wildlife and those you know. Another way that you can get to know your wild neighbors is to get involved with local organizations that are working to protect wildlife in your area. Whether that's people who are doing wildlife rehabilitation or people working to protect parks and natural areas. There are a lot of different groups that really know a lot about local wildlife and want to help educate and protect as well. And then finally, as we get to know our wild neighbors, we can change our own behaviors at home. And this involves things like if you live in an area where there are bears, then you probably have practices around keeping your trash cans indoors or locked down so that the bears don't get into them. Don't leave things like dog food outside that can attract wildlife. Keep cats indoors. And don't use pesticides. Even if you're in an urban area, you can choose what types of things you're putting outdoors that may affect the well-being of our wild neighbors. The next action I'm going to talk about is voting with your wallet. So as I mentioned earlier, individuals, we all have an influence on the market. And we've really seen this in action, particularly with food, right? Consumer demand has changed the way that the dairy aisle looks, right? It's no longer all dairy from cows and then, like maybe one bottle of soy milk. Like now you see a wide variety of options of all different kinds of dairy. And that gives people who want to make changes in what they're consuming, whether it's for health reasons or medical reasons or ethical reasons, more options. And that has happened because of consumer demand. We've also seen consumer demand change fast food members. We're seeing fast food menus. We're seeing more and more plant-based options showing up in everywhere from, Burger King up to pubs and grills and fancy restaurants. Like we're seeing it across the board that menus have changed because of demand, because people want more options. And a lot of this demand that we're seeing, the majority of it isn't coming from people who are already vegetarian and vegan or who are becoming vegetarian or vegan. That number tends to stay pretty constant, but we're seeing more and more people who are eating meat just start to incorporate more plant-based meals into their lives. And we've even seen this cause like meat companies like Tyson to start investing in plant-based meat. And again, it's about replacing to a more sustainable level, not necessarily eliminating all of these products, but creating more options. And that's all happened because of consumer demand. So, of course, the choices that you make with food, which Jennifer's going to talk a little bit more about in a minute, can make a huge difference. But it's not just food. There are other, every purchase that we make has an impact on the world. And it can be really hard to identify the practices of companies that specifically affect wolves. Most of them aren't out there saying things like, we've brought in wildlife services, or saying out there that we particularly protect wolves. But some companies are clear that they support conservation or have values around specific environmental issues like climate change, habitat protection, or pesticide use. But we do know that there are certain industries that tend to pose threats, as Jennifer discussed. So buying less of those items eases pressure on wolves and other wildlife. And again, it's not just food. We also see this in clothing. Livestock production also leads to leather and wool. So rethinking, what types of clothes we buy can make a big difference. And I know this can be a tricky area because a lot of the alternatives when we think about what clothing we're buying are products that may come with their own environmental impacts. We see a lot of alternatives, maybe synthetic fabrics and even, some that are polyester or plastic based, which comes with its own host of issues. Which is why one of the best ways that we can vote with our wallet is actually by buying less, by embracing conscious consumption. And that means really taking a step back, and before we buy things, think about is this something that I really need? And if it is there a better option of what I can buy? Is there something that's available, that I could reuse or buy used or rent if it's something that you're only going to use for a short amount of time? You can also look into options about, you can also look into different sorts of resale options, community swap items, like community swaps for clothing, becoming really popular, especially with kids' clothes because they grow out of it so quickly. It's really about just being more thoughtful with what it is that you're buying. And that's not to say that you can't ever buy anything, that you need to live a minimalist life, but it can go a long way just to take a step back and think twice before you make a purchase. And then the last way that you can really vote with your wallet is, of course, through donations. That if you can, support conservation organizations that are really out there, fighting for wolves and fighting for other wildlife and working to change these policies out there to get wolves the protections that they need. And now, since it is such a big part of our impact on wolves, as well as on our daily lives and identities, Jennifer's going to talk a bit more about the diet shifts that can help wildlife.
Yeah, thank you. And This is one of the more uncomfortable areas for people to talk about for a variety of reasons. But one of the best things we can do as wolf advocates is reduce our beef consumption. And that means going to plant-based options rather than just chicken or more meat or even seafood or dairy. Reducing consumption is the only way to make the better production options feasible. So the vast majority of beef production is from factory farms. And I think we can all agree that they are just catastrophic industries. But they're also highly subsidized. And the only way to allow for better practices is to reduce the pressure on the system, to reduce the demand. And that's the way that we can create a better market. So, I know that some people are going to want to say, I want to go plant-based, or I want to eliminate beef as a wolf advocate. Not everybody's going to do that. Some people might say, well, I want to support my ranching friends, or I'm a rancher myself. The best thing for the ranchers who are wanting to do the right thing is to create a system that's environmentally responsible, and that can't happen with the current demand. So we're going to have to reduce the pressure in that system. And that also helps us walk the talk as advocates. And so some of the ways that we can start, right, are with familiar dishes. If you're a burger lover, try plant-based burgers or a variety of different burgers. If you are into burritos, swap the beef for beans, that kind of thing. There's any number of recipes. We have it on our website as well, takeextinctionoffyourplate.com. But there's recipes all over the internet, and it just kind of starts with being committed as a wolf advocate. I've been to wolf conferences for many years, and I was always astounded when we talk about the harms that wolves face and how the system is just set against them, and then we go across the street and half the participants would eat beef burgers, right? So there's a disconnect there. So one of the things that we can do as wolf advocates that I really want people to do, and I think this is why I'm kind of making this presentation, this plea for us, is talking about the connection between wolves and cattle and shifting the way that we think about it and talk about it and the way that the public thinks about it and talks about it, and normalize this connection between wolf and cow, that wolf lovers eat less beef and they support better practices in the ranching industry. So talk about this, make this easy to talk about, make this normalized, because it's uncomfortable for people to talk about diets. You think, well, I'm whacking my finger, or I'm telling them what to do, or it's their choice, that kind of thing. And that's why systemic policy is also really important. But normalizing this conversation and bringing it up to people who love wildlife and wild places is really one great way as an advocate you can just make a difference in your daily life. Other ways that you can have these conversations are tell organizations that you belong to that you'd like them to eliminate beef, for example, or reduce their beef. Events that you attend, office parties. If and when we get back together after COVID and we're having these in-person events, make menu change suggestions. Reach out to me, Earth Friendly Diet at biologicaldiversity.org if you want suggestions. But conferences, meetings, offices, events, and so forth. Schools, ask your local school to make menu revisions. Have a wolf-friendly day for children. Explain, the connections. Make a presentation, that kind of thing. Again, have materials for this if you want to reach out to me. But it is really important, and that's why we're honing on it. And so the science that we're looking at, right, says that in terms of climate change and other environmental harms, beef is so harmful that Americans and others in the West need to really reduce their consumption by 90%, right? So it's not like, I just eat a little less. It's substantial. The problem is enormous, and the problem is enormous for wolves. So that might look like thinking about beef as more of a luxury item, thinking about beef differently, how your diet forms around that. And then for other meat items, cutting back by about half. That's where we need to go. And again, there's recipes all over. And so I want to say that, changing our diet, normalizing that, talking about it with other people, asking for menu policy changes is a great action that you could take. And so now I think, in terms of what a diet is going to look like, a lot of people will say, well, I eat a local diet and I support local farmers and predator-friendly beef if it's available in limited locations and so forth. And my diet's local. And so I just want to throw out there, because I think local is really important, especially as we learned with the pandemic, local small systems and community-based agriculture is really important. Larger industrial agriculture is a problem. At the same time, when you look at things like food miles and impacts on wildlife, local isn't always better. When it comes to meat production, specifically beef production, eating less is more substantial in terms of the impact that you have. The food miles are 1 to 4% of the GHGs for beef production in particular. So eating local is great. Organic is important. Humane, just food systems that are dignified for human workers. All of these things need to come together. But eating less beef needs to be part of that conversation as well. Another way you can get involved, become an activist for community influence. We're all kind of stuck at home these days. Use social media. We have our social media, I think, listed here. And reach out to us, share our campaigns, share other campaigns. Again, really normalize the conversation that as a wolf lover, your diet is important and the diets of others are important. We need better policies. The last thing I would say is don't waste wildlife. What does that mean? And does it mean wasting them, direct killing only, but don't waste wildlife in terms of our precious natural resource in terms of food production. So food waste is a problem too. We waste 40% of the food that we produce in the United States. That's a problem for everyone, for the enormous hunger insecurity, food insecurity issue that we have, for the environmental costs of producing food, the water waste, the toxic manure, everything that goes along with it, the landfills. But meat specifically, even though it's not the majority of the food that's waste, has an environmental footprint that's much higher when we produce the food. So wasting meat is really harmful. So let's do what we can to reduce food waste from the grocery store, in our houses, in restaurants, when we're ordering it. Think about wildlife while we're making all these connections, while we're eating, while we're shopping, while we're going to restaurants, while we're advocating for policy, while we're doing wolf initiatives. Put diet in there as well too. Policy and individual choice can really help us protect wolves. It eases pressure on the system, I think, as I've said before, and Stephanie's going to talk a little bit more about how, and I think alluded to this, helping the entire system, helping wolves, advocating for animals and the environment is also going to help people as well, and vice versa.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. When it comes to food, we talked a little bit about this earlier, that, for example, with the industrial food system, which we know is particularly bad for wolves and wildlife, it's also particularly bad for the workers. It comes with some of the most dangerous jobs in slaughterhouses. It comes with some of the most toxic exposures for farm workers in the fields. And so we know that when we're able to shift to a system that is more humane, that's more localized, that's organic, that's really focused on both people and wildlife, we create a system that's healthier for everybody. But I also want to talk about this in terms of, kind of pull back to the big picture, because our world is their world. And when we think about some of the greatest crises that are facing us today, this is something that we have in common with wolves and other wildlife, that we deeply have in common with them. If you think about climate change, for wildlife, it alters their habitat. It has a cascading effect on species. It impacts their homes and their food supplies. But as we've also seen, particularly this summer, that storms and wildfires also affect our homes. And climate change is already changing crop yields and even the nutritional value of some crops. And so it's made our own food supply particularly unpredictable as well. And the IPC says we have less than 10 years to cut emissions in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And that's both for us and for wolves and other wildlife. And of course, we're also in the midst of an extinction crisis. Experts predict that 1 million species are at risk of extinction in the coming decades. Wolves are literally in the crosshairs on this issue. But humans rely on healthy ecosystems to survive too. We've seen how reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone has increased the overall health of the park, from beavers to aspens. And we see that really around the world, that when we have healthy wildlife, we have healthy ecosystems. And for us, that means healthier air and water as well. And again, sort of related to the food issue, but really, broader when we look at things politically as well, the systems and policies that harm wildlife are often the same that are harming people. These are systems that prioritize private interests, and those interests that are exploiting people and the environment, that are oppressing Indigenous, Black, Latinx, and communities of color. And these are often the same interests that are polluting and destroying wild places. And so when we're able to stand up for a healthier and more just world, we are often helping wildlife and ourselves. Again, our survival and justice are tied to wildlife. But it's not just about that. We know that, in addition to obviously we need things like clean air and water, but also being connected to nature increases our quality of life and well-being. And there are a lot of studies that show that our ability to go outside and to be in natural areas, and this doesn't necessarily even mean deep wilderness, but even city parks, that our ability to connect with nature improves our happiness and improves our health in many different ways. And also, when we have empathy towards animals, it helps build empathy toward each other. And all of these are obviously really important factors to us as humans. But there is also this piece that the world is just a richer place with wolves and other wildlife in it. And beyond all of these different ecosystem impacts and benefits, that it would be a tragic, tragic world if we were to lose wolves. And so helping animals helps people in direct ways, but it also makes the world a better place for all of us. Thank you.
Hello, Stephanie and Jennifer. Welcome to Sedona Wolf Week for the first time. We're so happy to have you here. And I want to introduce, before we dive into the conversation, Ron, an Apex Protection Project volunteer who will be interpreting for the deaf during this Q&A. So Jennifer and Stephanie, that's very informative and a lot of information in that presentation. And I especially love the last parts where you're connecting, the survival of humans to wild things in wild spaces. I often get asked why wolves, and it's really the stepping stone for such a greater conversation. So was really thrilled to see that as part of your presentation. I want to start with you, Stephanie, because you wrote this book. You told us about it. I immediately bought it, dog-eared it to death. I highly recommend it. It's also a silent auction item. Thank you so much for that donation. For those who haven't read it, or first, let's talk about what inspired you, because you said something really funny on our call one time about, hey, just because you eat bacon doesn't mean you can't help animals. And I might not be getting that quote right, but if you could dive into that a little bit, I would really love the listeners to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you enjoyed the book so much. There were a few things that inspired me. And, one of the main things is that ever since I was a little kid, I made my love for animals pretty clear. And then in college, I started working at the local animal shelter and then moved into environmental and animal advocacy. And so while I was very much out there with the actions that I was taking for animals, I would hear so often from other people who, were either obsessed with their dog or cat, or loved wolves, or, loved bird watching, or had some passion for animals. But beyond that, they just didn't know what to do. And, they were always like, oh, I admire that you're working for this, but I can't really do anything. Or they felt that it was all or nothing, that if they couldn't give up that one thing, whether it was bacon or cheese, to, become fully vegan, or, whether they're family hunted, even though they adopted their dogs, or whatever it might be, it was seen as this very all or nothing, either or sort of situation. And so I really wanted to write this book to try to make animal advocacy more accessible to people, and to show people that no matter what kind of animal you love, no matter where you're coming from, that there are actions that you can take to help animals, as well as helping this larger ecosystem that, as you pointed out, helps both people and animals.
Absolutely. And you hit the nail right on the head, because I know for some, it can seem really overwhelming, right? The changes that, oh my gosh, I still eat cheese, right? I actually hear that from a lot of people. I don't eat meat anymore, but I still eat cheese. Am I a bad person? And so I love that there, along the spectrum, are all steps that we can take in all elements of our life, right? That can make a difference, which your book really dives into. Another section that your book dives into that I think is equally as important is the words we use. We touched on that a little bit this week with, the lone wolf. A few people have brought that up, and some other things as well. I don't know if you guys would like to comment on that, but I feel that is just as important as it is in terms of changing our behaviors.
Yeah, language matters a lot. And I think as a society, we've recently been learning that more and more when it comes to social justice and racial justice issues, that what we talk about and the way that we talk about really has an impact. And, I think as animal advocates, it's something to think about, that the language that we use also has an impact on the animals that we care about. It changes the way that other people perceive them. It can change, whether there's support for protections for them or not, as well as helping people, better envision the way that animals fit into our world. So yeah, it's really important to think about how we talk about them, not just the type of advocacy that we're doing.
Absolutely. And I think it's okay to say that we learn this every day.
Absolutely.
I learned something new this week myself, actually. So Jennifer, I gave you credit for that light bulb moment when we were talking about all these various, things we're going to discuss today. And you said the connection piece is that we all love wolves. And what I really loved about your presentation is it really shows how what we eat and how it can impact wolves and wildlife. I didn't even know that was a job. I'd love to hear more about what you do at the center.
Yeah, thank you. So I run the Take Extinction Off Your Plate campaign. You can find that at takeextinctionoffyourplate.com. And that's part of our main website. But I run the food campaigns that help people understand the connection between food and our environment, and particularly biodiversity and wildlife like wolves and the connection. So, as I think I probably said, when we eat a burger, we understand that we're having an impact on the cow. We might not understand that we're having maybe an impact on cattle, or on bison or wolves or any pollinators, any other number of wild species, and that everything is interconnected. So if we start from the commonality and the common ground of we all love wolves, to then branch out from there and talk about, our diets and our impact on the planet and the whole spectrum of how we can make the world a better place by coexisting, and how, ranching, livestock production interacts with the environment. I think that we can really start with, we all love animals, and that's how we start as children. We start off with those animals that are closest to us. It's often a dog or a cat. It's branched out as animal advocates for wolves and other animals. And let's start there. And let's start there as a motivation for why we would make dietary changes, why we want our values to be in harmony with our menus and so forth, and to just really make that connection. So I'm excited to have this really rare kind of job at the Center for Biological Diversity, where I try to help people make that connection and take their passion for wildlife and wilderness and outdoor spaces and really help them understand that their diets and the production of food far away is having an impact on those places and those animals.
Absolutely. Well, I'm looking at some of the comments and questions coming through, and they're really wonderful. There is a question, and it's a couple parts, from Deborah Lee. Thank you for a great presentation. What do you find the biggest challenge when dealing with the challenges? Is it climate change, behavioral change, or the importance of biodiversity for ecosystem health, or a combination? So that's quite a big one. Who would like to tackle that? Maybe start with, what do we think the biggest challenges are to change?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that, like I said, there are a couple of pieces in there. I think when we're talking about the change that's needed to fight climate change and to stop the extinction crisis, to me, one of the biggest barriers are these cultural norms that we have around food in particular, but also around how animals are treated, because that infiltrates into the individual decisions that we're making, as well as what types of things are considered important by policymakers. And with food in particular, it can be really challenging, because even if people really care about animals, or they care about the environment, or they recognize the health benefits of eating more of a plant-based diet, we're still so used to the foods that we eat, and they become part of our individual identity. A lot of times they're part of our cultural identity and our background. We just have so many strong associations with them that can make it really hard, not only for individual change, but in terms of having that broader conversation about what diets should look like. There is this thing out about the American diet, that as Americans, we have the right to eat hamburgers every day. And there is this concept around things like that this is who we are, eating these meat-heavy diets. And so that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges of just shifting that whole cultural perception.
Yeah, and for me, it's adding history into this piece as well, and understanding the perspective long-term that we haven't always eaten this way. Americans eat 2 to 3 times as much meat in particular than the rest of the world. And it hasn't always been this way. It hasn't always been these portions, for example. And, you just think about how hard it is to get people to wear masks sometimes. So diet is kind of like that, with sometimes a resistance of, I'll eat what I want to eat. And so that's why it's really important for us to think about our diet in terms of how we want to make a difference on, in terms of the environment and on the planet. But it's beyond the personal choice too, right? Like sometimes it's accessibility and justice issues and so forth. And that's why we really want systemic change on a wider scale, to all these kinds of foods that are better for the planet are widely available and available to all. But, so that it's not just this question of a connection to what's traditional or what I think is historical, or, the diet that came before that, but really getting back more to our roots, even beyond, the advent of this livestock explosion, and just really understanding that these foods are available and we can make these changes that are easy. And, anywhere we go, anytime, we're going to have planet-friendly food.
Absolutely. And, you brought up an interesting point, because there are social justice issues related to food, and it's not always so easy to, first of all, have the resources or the accessibility to, I guess what we would say in this presentation, better choices. I know when I've traveled the U.S. to some very rural areas, your options are Walmart, and that's it, right? And that, you can still make good choices at Walmart, but it doesn't lend itself in that direction, right? It almost kind of drives it in the other, in the other direction. So I agree with you. Options, resources, capacity, accessibility all play a role in this as well.
It's kind of it's a mixed bag on that. On the one hand, there's a misperception that these foods are aligned with sort of white elite privilege, and that's not true. It's plant-based foods are a traditional part of many kinds of diets and many economic levels, and there's many ways to get at the plant-based diet. But at the same time, there is this justice issue where people might live so far from really quality organic produce, or the climate isn't right for that, or as you say, maybe their biggest store is something like a gas station that's closest by, and this is really segregated on race, on class, and so forth, in unfair ways. And one of the ways that can be changed, for example, is why are we subsidizing beef to such a degree? Why are we subsidizing this big polluter to such a degree? Why aren't we making more plants and fruits and vegetables available to everybody across the board? And shouldn't that be the kind of thing that our government funds should go towards?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Absolutely.
One other thing to add to that, to think about when it comes to the social justice around food choices, is there's obviously a huge piece that's driven by subsidy and cost and availability, but there's also this social and psychological aspect to accessibility as well, which is driven by things like there's an enormous amount of money put into advertising junk food in low-income communities and communities of color. There's a lot that goes into, for example, our dietary guidelines that heavily promote dairy, and dairy is basically a requirement in schools, but a lot of communities of color, like people tend to have higher rates of lactose intolerance. So we just find a lot of these racial inequities and a lot of this kind of white supremacy thinking throughout our food policy, not just when it comes to cost and subsidies, but also when it comes to nutrition education, to the way that food is promoted, and all of the other ways that we perceive food and understand what healthy diets are, in addition to this piece of what's available and what's affordable, and and like Jennifer said, kind of reconnecting with traditional diets that are more plant-based. So there are a lot of these barriers on many different levels.
Do you think to help overcome some of those barriers would be, we've talked a lot about the children being our future. Is this getting into the schools and starting with the kids and working our way up to the adults, or how do you feel about what is some ways that we can combat what you just talked about? Because those seem like very immense barriers.
Yeah. Jennifer, do you want to talk about some of the schoolwork, and then I can talk about some of the other pieces?
Sure. 30 million children across the United States are impacted by the school meal program, and making plant-based foods and healthier foods more available to children, even just at the lunch program, will make a tremendous difference for the environment and therefore for wolves also. And, that accustoms children to understand the connection between our planet and biodiversity and the way that food is produced. There are curriculum ways that we can integrate this into classroom, and I think that's a good opportunity to be able to talk about this. And children, like I said, innately love animals, and they love getting involved with the environment, and they're open to these choices, and they want to eat foods that's delicious. So it's a good opportunity and can also make a big impact in that way. So yes, I definitely think it's the future. Through the children, not only making the food available, but getting them excited about the connections, just like we are.
Absolutely. And have you found, if this is applicable, have you found schools to be open to those sorts of, because there's definitely momentum out there, I'm seeing it, right, to move towards a plant-based diet or incorporate plants more into your diet. Have the schools been receptive to these types of programs?
Yeah, it really works best when the community is involved and the parents are involved as well, to kind of put pressure and say, we'd like our children to have better food, because these things often go hand in hand. If they're eating highly processed food, highly processed meats, it's not healthy for them. It doesn't taste good. And for many of the students, this is the only meal or nutrition that they're getting. So everybody getting involved to help put pressure on this system from the ground up and then from the top back down again. So yeah, I think it's really important to get the parents involved, and that's the way that it can move forward. Sometimes there's resistance, and there's this thought that, children are only going to eat chicken nuggets, and that hasn't been proven to be the case. Kids like to try new things, and they like good food.
And some of the resistance that we see in schools is related to federal policy. It's because there are certain guidelines set by USDA, for example, of what schools need to serve in order to get reimbursed by the school lunch program. So sometimes the combination of that and the really low amount, like per meal, that schools have to spend on food is, it winds up creating these barriers where a lot of times people just don't have the resources. They may not have the knowledge of how to be creative, in changing up the menus within those parameters. And so there are these kind of larger systemic pieces, like Jennifer was talking about earlier, that we advocate for, that that can really help, not just reach children, but also change, across all ages, the way that we think about things like nutrition education and the way that we influence what kinds of food is available. Because the dietary guidelines, for example, they determine the menus in schools, but they also influence the menus in military facilities, prisons, hospitals, government cafeterias. So there are a huge amount of people who are eating based on these guidelines that can be improved in order to, overcome some of the barriers we talked about and make plant-based foods more normalized and more available.
Yes, so it seems more of a self-serving policy than one that actually serves the people that it's being presented to, right? So yeah, I'm getting a few comments about that in the live stream here about the USDA and the industries that it's really in alignment with, and not so much the good of the people. I want to jump a little bit to, it's actually your colleague, Avarook, and a great friend of Sedona Wolf Week. What recommendations do you have for folks to lobby regarding the Farm Bill to reduce subsidies for meat production and ensure that support is provided for production of plants?
Well, the Farm Bill in particular is a really complicated piece of legislation. It's really hard to crack, and it's something that comes up once every 5 years, and it's just stuffed full of all kinds of different kinds of policies. It's hard to unravel. But that said, I think there are a few things that can happen with that in particular. I would say, start early and start often in letting your representatives know that you care about this and this is important to you. Organize your community and people around you to increase that pressure on your representatives to let them know that this is something you care about. But even outside of that subsidy structure, which is hugely important, there are a lot of things that we can do in terms of starting to shift the way that people think about diet and the way that, like, what kinds of foods are available. And some of that can happen through these other sort of dietary policies, government purchasing policies are a really good avenue. You can start, from the local level, the state and federal level. They all have purchasing policies that can be influenced to emphasize more plant-based options and reducing the meat and dairy that they, that they purchase. And I think that this is one of those areas where the policy is really complex, but where individuals have a lot of power to start shifting the market that will increase that overall pressure to, to really show politicians that there's movement behind this, that shifting these subsidies is something that is going to have to happen, that we're going to have to change this broken and corrupt subsidy system that we have. And I think all of the advocacy that we do on all levels around, around improving diets and making plant-based foods more accessible helps create that political will that will ultimately help shift that subsidy structure.
Yeah, Jennifer, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I mean, we just imagine if we make collectively this decision to reduce beef specifically, along with other items, just imagine the impact that would have on the marketplace, and it is having on the marketplace, which in turn can impact policy decisions and shift subsidies as well. I mean, you just imagine if we're reducing the amount of cattle out there on the land, reduces the conflict that they create with wolves, then we can transform the vast swath of America that grow the monocrops, soy and corn, for example, drenched in pesticides. And instead of feeding that to cattle, we can transform it into, complex pastures, diverse crops for humans with a significantly less impact on the planet and with less cows running around creating conflict. So shifting subsidies that way really transforms the landscape. And all we have to do is start to make decisions on our own for our diets.
Absolutely.
Again, that's not all we have to do.
Yeah, there's a lot that we need to do. Do you mind? I know you said some websites in the very beginning, because we've talked about a lot of things, and you're right, some of this is incredibly complex. We've got Stephanie's book. Everyone get the book, please. It's got some amazing things in it. And Jennifer, what was that website again where you talked about what you do? I just want to make sure we get it in the comments here.
Sure. Take Extinction off your plate.
Got it. Great. Okay. Any final words of advice for everybody? What we can do as soon as we leave this presentation? What can we do?
Tell people if you love wolves, eat less beef.
Okay. Stephanie?
I would say right now we have Thanksgiving coming up. And so now is a really good chance to kind of start rethinking some of those holiday traditions. The holidays coming up tend to be really heavy on meat and dairy. And, this year in particular, I think is a really good year for us to take a step back, plan how we can maybe adjust those traditions to be more wildlife friendly, in terms of, serving less meat and dairy, better planning to reduce the amount of food waste that goes into the holidays, and all of those sorts of things. So there's a really great opportunity now for people to start taking action on that very personal level.
Absolutely. And I could not agree with you more. And just to speak to traditions real quick, I switched our tradition in our home a few years ago when I moved to a plant-based lifestyle, and the guests who came thoroughly enjoyed it. So the spirit of the holiday was not lost just because we didn't have a turkey on the table. But that's me, and that's my experience. So I just wanted to share that with all of you. Thank you so much. I actually could listen to you both all day long. I think what you both do is fascinating, and there's so much to learn from you. So thank you very much for being here today, and hopefully we'll see you in person someday soon.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you.